was, I think, 3 years old when I was told about God for the first time, that God has created everything. And then I asked my mother, who created God? And she was appalled. And she said, nobody asks that, nobody created God, don't ever say that again. And she freaked out. That wasn't the only thing I did as a kid. I was quite an unruly child. But then I grew up around Islam. We used to read the Quran every day. I was memorizing part of it without actually understanding it, just the Arabic. So I can read and write Arabic, but I don't speak Arabic. So I don't know what it means, but I know how to read and write it. I was memorizing a huge portion of it. I was, deep into the whole argument of, we need to reach the perfect society and we need to get to that point, and everybody's letting their politics come into religion and are manipulating Islam for their own sake and blah, blah, blah. So I used to say that against the religious extremists in the country and the religious parties in the country, because we don't have anybody who's an atheist. Like, I hadn't met anybody who was an atheist until way after I personally decided that I was. It's 98% Muslim in Pakistan. So as I started getting more and more into religion, I actually started getting more into religion than most people around me, because Pakistan, contrary to the impression, people are not as religious as you may think. It's more about the rhetoric and just it's spiel. People don't pray mostly, people party, alcohol, even though it's illegal, is available. And that is one thing that all the TV channels know, they censor it out. All the news reports know, they censor it out. They just don't publish it because it's against the law, and then the state will have to do something against the elites who actually are partly the state themselves. So you have that side, and then you have the other side where you have this Islam growing, which I would call the Wahhabi Islam, because that's how it was introduced to me. However, as I learned more and more, that perception sort of changed a little as well. Now, the Wahhabi Islam is about exactly what is in the Quran, what is in the Hadith. We need to discard all of the thousands of years of history, actually 1,400 years of history, sorry, of Islamic thought and all of that, and just stick to what the Quran and the Sunnah has said, so that we can basically be true Muslims, and that everybody else is actually a non-Muslim. And then I started going to different classes and sessions until one thing happened. I mean, I bought into the logic, everything made sense to me, the whole world made sense to me, everything just fit perfectly together, until there was a clash. When I first started understanding the Quran and reading its meaning, came to an ayah in Surah Nuh which said, men are the guardians, protector, different versions of this, but in that class it was said, men are the guardians of women and they're a degree above them. And I was so perturbed by this, because growing up in an extremely misogynistic country, it's the third worst in the world for women, I had to fight against my mother, my cousins, my father especially, everybody to say, I am an equal. And I remember as a child, I used to deny that women are actually weaker physically than men, because that's what everybody used to throw at me. That, oh, men are stronger, hence they're superior. And I used to say, no, I could beat any of my cousins right now. And then I used to wrestle them. So, I mean, so having come to that point where I actually heard that God is saying in his own words that women are inferior to men. Even though they're equal in his eyes, in the social framework, they're inferior to him. I couldn't come to terms with it. I went up to the teacher and I asked her, why? She said, because they have more responsibility, hence they have more power. And I said, what if I were to take more responsibility? I want to work, I want to have a life beyond that of just raising children. And she said, well, still, it's not mandatory for you to do. So if you do it, it's optional, it's your choice, but that doesn't relieve you of your burdens in life that God has given you, and hence you don't get that power. And I just couldn't believe that. So I'm just going to read this one little quotation from the Quran, which basically says, whenever Allah and the Apostle have decided a matter, it is not for a faithful man or woman to follow a course of their own choice. So I was at a crossroad. Either, give up all of my perceptions of what is right and wrong, my personal morality, because I actually had one, which was separate from religion, which I didn't know until that very point. That was when I discovered that my ideas about life are actually not entirely dependent on religion. And then either I had to give that up and follow, submit, or I had to basically discard everything and say that, you know, sorry, I don't believe in anything. But I couldn't do that, of course. I mean, it took me, I believe, maybe 7 years and countless oscillations of, you know, saying there's no God, then saying no, there is a God. I've considered myself very close to God. I used to talk to him, you know, turn to him in my weakest moments. And there's this thing in Islam where you're supposed to remember God all the time. When you wake up, the first thought on your mind needs to be God, and, you know, it's this whole thing, and basically whatever he says has infinite wisdom in it, and you cannot question that. And then that's just like a brief overview of where I'm coming from and who I am. And after much education, I actually undertook, as a part of my undergraduate degree, I became a lawyer. As a part of that course, I studied Sharia law and Islamic jurisprudence for a year, and I also, during my practices, I was defending the, you know, clients of blasphemy. I actually got even more deeper into different things relevant to that. And during a feminist developments in feminist theory class, I actually embarked on this research project about the whole women's rights issue, because that was a real stickler for me, and I couldn't choose Islam without resolving that. So I went to the gut. So now, whenever you ask a Muslim apologist about women, what do they say? Oh, you know, Islam is the religion that has given them the most rights. Before Islam, you know, it's called the Jahiliyyah period. Jahiliyyah means savage, illiterate, uneducated. And it was the Dark Ages, and, you know, women were like cattle, they were property, they couldn't do anything, they were basically, you know, there was female infanticide that was so prevalent, and so on and so forth, like horrible tales of how women's condition was. And basically all women were slaves, and all women were somehow killed as babies but still survived. And I remember questioning that as a kid. I asked my mom, if all the babies were killed, how were there any women to procreate? How did humanity proceed? And my mom was like, well, you know, they let some of them live. So, men and women, of course, took multiple spouses, all of that. And until I came across, you know, cultural anthropology and feminism, and I discovered that actually Saudi Arabia, to a large degree, was a matrilineal society, and I was struck by that. And then that's where my research began into this, and I just wanted to share some of that with you guys, because I think that that is what is used as a huge basis of the justification of the subjugation of the woman, as well as, you know, of the elevation of the Sharia law on the subject, as well as to say that, you know, it's okay to do this to 51% of the women, essentially. I mean, 51% of the population of the earth, but I would also, what I would add to this before I get into it, is that the problem that I came towards, you know, the head-to-head, where either submit entirely in the way that it is, or discard it all, which essentially in a Muslim state would mean death. I could never tell anyone in Pakistan what my beliefs were. My parents were freaked out about this. I told them, and my mom thinks that since the Prophet got his revelations at the age of 40, when I turn 40, I will as well see the light. So she you know, calls me and threatens me that don't eat, you know, pork, and don't eat in those utensils, otherwise we're not going to let you enter the home because you'll be unclean, even though you don't believe in it, follow this. So she's trying to keep me, you know, clean and pure as much as she can, even though she knows I no longer believe in the Islam that was taught to me. I'm still on the edge towards whether I want to call myself a cultural Muslim or not, because there's certain aspects of the culture that I like, there's certain that I despise. And that's an identity question that I will eventually, I suppose, resolve. However, I have a right to that identity, whether or not I believe in God, whether or not I believe that Quran is the word of God. I have a right to that identity, and nobody has the right to take that away from me. That's it. Now, I think that also is the biggest problem of Islam today. The crisis of Islam, essentially, is that it's come to a point where it can no longer apply in the way that it is, and it's refusing to evolve. It's refusing to change certain things. And if you don't do that, what happens? I mean, eventually, like if a stick's not going to bend, it's going to break. And Islam has to bend. That's what has to be done. So generally, I think what I would do very briefly, looking at the time, is first of all talk about the matrilineal society that exists. And I must say, I was extremely struck by what I found, because things like marriage, divorce, sexuality, children, paternity were so liberal. I don't know if liberal is the right word, but yeah, we're so different that even today, I think even people here in Britain would be like, whoa, I think that's going a little too far. So what used to happen? Men and women both could marry as many, there were no limitations. Society did not place restrictions on sexuality. A large structure was tribal, with mother right prevailing. So it was a matrilineal society, i.e. the name of the mother goes to the child, the property, everything is owned by the tribe, it's communally owned, and the children of the woman belong to the woman. They do not belong to the husband. They never live with the husband's family. It's called a verilocal marriage, where basically all the children live with the mother and the husband visits her. And actually, this is something that Muslims will have, Islamic historians of that period have completely excluded, is that the Prophet's own parents had that form of marriage. His mother never lived with the Quraysh. His mother lived with his own tribe. His father used to visit him. Also, up until her death, he lived with her and carried the last name of that tribe. And there's actually an ayah in the Quran, I believe, somewhere about that, because some people used to make fun of that. Because now Quraysh was, Makkah was a trading city. So they were the ones who used to go and interact with the outer world, which was largely countries which were extremely patriarchal, and they were bringing back, certain values from there, and then the ideas of private property ownership as they were getting rich because of trade. However, the largest part of Arabia, which was, mostly Bedouin as they're called, which is, going from place to place to find in the desert. So they were largely matrilineal. Even like Medina, the second center of Islam, which became the ultimate center of Islam, was all matrilineal. There's a hadith in Bukhari. Bukhari is the most authentic book of hadith. Now there's a hadith in the Bukhari where Umar, the second caliph, complains to the Prophet that we used to dominate, and I'm quoting here, we used to dominate our women. However, the people here are dominated by their women, and our women are taking on those ideas. And he actually complained to him about that. There was very little intermarriage between them, because the women here, even though they had converted to Islam, couldn't really deal with the polygamy thing, because actually in Medina and in a larger part of Saudi Arabia, it was more common for women to have multiple husbands than for husbands to have multiple wives. This was, of course, quite interesting, because the idea was that it's the offspring that's valuable, because a tribe is only as powerful as the number of people it has. So there was that. Now let's talk about paternity. Paternity under Islam has become the sole ownership of the father. So the father owns the child. The father has all the rights to the child, and the mother actually does not have rights to the child beyond for what the child depends on her. So if, for example, parents split up, a Sharia court has to give custody to the father. Now, unless the child needs the mother, is dependent on the mother. So there are different interpretations of that. Some people say, well, the child only depends on the mother until he's suckling on her breast. Some people say that, until, a boy is 7 and a girl is 12, that's what happens in Pakistan, so on and so forth. There are different interpretations. But basically, in the end, the child goes to the father. The mother has no right on the child, except for demanding his respect or her respect. There's that. There's whereas in the Jahiliyyah time, the woman who would have multiple husbands, once she would give birth, would actually call all of them and say to them, point to a man and say, "You are the father," and the man had no right to deny that. He would be the father. He would perform the role of the father. The father was, being a father was not about genetics. It was not about passing on your DNA to the baby. It was about, you know, being that figure, having that connection with someone. So when a woman would marry another man, all her children from the previous marriages would actually become his offspring. They would call him father, and he would act as their father. And I mean, I have so many different quotations and references here, and I can provide all of them, but due to, I think, generally a lack of time, I'm not going to go into a lot. But I will quote one thing. Ibn Battuta in the 14th century writes this, and he's somebody who's a Muslim, that women of Zebed were perfectly ready to marry strangers. If the husband would depart, his wife could not be induced to accompany him. Moreover, any children from the marriage would belong to her. I have countless scholars over here, I think more than 20, who have done this type of research and have come up with these various things. Also, another thing which is very interesting to do with sexuality is the idea of war. Now, when war would happen or trade would happen, people would go away for ages, years and years and years. Now, the husband actually, if it was like just one husband and one wife, or basically what you would call, there was this provision which was a contract. So all marriage is based on contract. So a man and a woman could contract to be monogamous to each other, essentially, which goes completely contrary to what Islamic apologist claims regarding, you know, the multiplicity of marriage. I mean, if that Islam put a limit to that, but no, I mean, a woman and a man could choose to do so if they wanted to. So then, if that husband was going away on war or trade, he was able to tell, you know, basically say to his wife or one of his friends to take care of her, and that would involve sexually if she wanted. So the idea that sex is this holy thing that only belongs to the husband didn't exist. Sometimes the husband would ask the wife to, you know, if he wanted if he considered his genetics to be inferior and he wanted a child who was really powerful or beautiful, he would actually, you know, say, "What do you think about that guy?" And that would also happen. And then that child would then be that husband's. I mean, which is so revolutionary. I mean, here people would not be okay with that, but people over there were. Now, one other thing that I would want to talk about is the tolerance of that society, and that I'm going to quote from what most Muslims also know, which is studied by them, is the idea to do with, you know, the beginning when the Prophet started preaching. Now, when that happened, it was, I'm going to quote Ibn Ishaq, who says that when the apostle openly displayed Islam as God ordered him, his people did not withdraw or turn against him, so far as I have heard, until he spoke disparagingly of their gods. The offer of leave us alone and we will leave him alone, let him have his religion and we will have ours. As Margaret quotes it, this was what was made to him. It was said to him that, stop disparaging our gods and we will let you exist with, you know, your beliefs and people who won't choose to be with you. And he said that if you put the sun in one hand and the moon in the other, I will still continue to preach in the way that I see fit. And then, I mean, Abu Talib, his uncle, who never believed in his faith, still protected him because of ties of the clan. I mean, that's very illustrative of, you know, their perception of how society would operate. And also an example is that monotheistic religion already existed. They were called Hanifs, who had already apostatized from the existing practices and said that, no, we only believe in one God. And there were no repercussions against them. The only thing that Arabs were actually unhappy about from the Prophet and his followers were that they were saying that their gods are lies and that their gods are barbaric and that their practices are savage. Basically, that's where the dispute was. And that's so telling. I mean, it's so like, and this little anecdote that I've mentioned is actually something that we study in Islamic history books as well, but we just never look at it that way. because that's not the context it's given to us in. Right. And briefly, women don't have a right to divorce in Islam. Women also are can only be half witnesses. And against all of this, and the problem that I posed about Islam, the crisis of Islam as not being willing to evolve in any manner, is blasphemy. So if you say anything against Islam, you will be killed. And that, again, is something that has not been universally upheld during time and history of Islamic cultures. A lot of Islamic scholars have actually said no. However, the Wahhabi version of Islam, which is Saudi Arabian, spreading like fire everywhere because, our books, like Pakistan is based on the Sufi version of Islam, which is much more tolerant and kind of like, oh, who cares about the book and who cares about the hadith? Basically, just be one with God and, have fun and dance and sing, basically. So that's the local sort of version of Islam, which is decried as an aberration. And now our schools actually teach us the Saudi version of Islam. But anyways, that being said, I think I will conclude, and if there's anything that anybody wants me to illustrate or go into details with, feel free to ask. Thank you.